Hello everyone and welcome back to our course. In this lecture, we are going to continue our Dash app project. Previously, we built out a Hello World quick Dash app. In this lecture, we're going to learn how we can actually build a graph with data in our app. All right, so currently we have a heading 1 that says My Dash App. We also have a paragraph. Let's add another element here, and this time we're not going to use HTML, but we're actually going to use Dash core components. So often you'll see this shortened to DCC, so we can just refer to this whole module Dash core components as DCC. So let's add from DCC a new graph object. So this is different from an HTML element. It's a Dash core component, and it's going to build a graph. All right. Typically, you want to give this graph an ID. For example, graph. Okay. Next up, we are going to add an HTML.label, and we are going to put in here an array starting with the color scale. Then we're going to use DCC to build a drop-down. So we're going to use Dash core components again. The ID of this drop-down is going to be color scale drop-down. Clearable we'll set to false, so we cannot clear it. The value we can set to plasma. And options, we can create an array for that. I'm going to loop through for every color in px, which was Plotly Express, dot colors dot named color scales. So this will give me every single color scale. All right, and here as well, not only that, but I want to add a label. So, oops, let's see what happened there. Oh, I just hit run accidentally. Okay, so I want to add here into this dictionary. The label is going to be the color, and the value is also going to be the color for every color in px.colors.named color scales. Then I just want to make sure that here I have my drop down being closed. Great, and then my div should be closed as well as my label. Okay, great, everything is closed properly. All right, now if I run this cell, I'm going to see here my Dash app, welcome, as well. I have this graph now, and I have a color scale, which allows me to select from different colors for my graph. This gives me all the different color options. We have reds, we have YLOR-BR, we have deep, gray, ice, all these different color options. And this was all thanks to Dash core components. So we now have a heading 1, we have a paragraph, we have a graph, and we also have a label which contains this drop-down menu. And that's all that we just managed to create. Awesome. So you see how easy it is to quickly create Dash apps. Next up, we are going to learn how we can actually populate this graph with data. Okay, so for that, let's go back into the same code cell, and I am going to define a function here that will be called update figure, and I'll pass in here my color scale. I'm going to return here Plotly Express. Remember, Plotly is a library for building graphs, charts, and figures, and I'm going to return a scatter plot. So if I'm using Plotly.scatter, px.scatter, this means I'm going to be creating for me a bunch of data points, like a scatter plot. I do have to pass in here several values. Okay, first I have to pass in my data frame, df. I have to pass in an x, and I'm just going to call this x. As well, my y, I'm going to pass in y. Then my color, I can set to size. As well, there's a color continuous scale. I'm going to set that to equal the color scale passed in. There's a render mode argument. We are going to use WebGL with the web graphics library. That is the typical render mode for rendering content on the web. Then we can also give this a title, Y versus X. All right, so now we have a function that is going to update our figure. And if I go into my preview here, well, you'll see that we still don't actually see the data. So one more thing that we have to add is a callback, which will actually do the updating of the graph. So this just defines the function, but we need to define a callback. So just make sure it's above update figure. We're going to use ampersand at app.callback to create a new callback. And I'm going to use here output in order to produce some output and also similarly input. Now, in order to use output and also input, we do have to import these. So go to the top of this cell and enter here from dash.dependencies. We need to import input and also output. This is going to allow us to update our graph, okay? So what do we pass here into input and output? Let's start with output. We are going to pass in our graph because we want to update the graph that has the ID graph, and we want to use figure, which will allow us to use update figure. Then the input. The input here is actually going to be an array. So inside of this array, we have the input, which is going to be color scale dropdown. Okay, so this means that whenever there is a change here on this color scale dropdown, just make sure here, by the way, that you use a hyphen instead of an equal sign in this ID. So whenever the color scale dropdown is interacted with, that's going to be considered input, and we're going to get its value from that. So we're going to get the value of that dropdown, whatever the user selects, and we're going to use that to produce the graph. So now let's run this code cell again, and I'm going to scroll down here, and just after a moment we'll see here is our graph, and if I select a color scale, it's going to be the selected value. Okay, next, how do we put the data onto the page? Well, it all comes down to what data frame we're using. Okay, so if we go to our data frame, we have here px.data.tips. This actually refers to a specific data set inside of Plotly Express. So Plotly has several data sets that you can use for testing. Tips is one of them. This has a bunch of data on tips where Y is the tip and X is the total bill. So in order to actually use that, here inside of px.scatter, I can't just pass in X and Y. I have to pass in total bill, and I have to pass in here tip. So I have to pass in for X and Y the exact names of the values that I had in my data frame. So because my PX data frame has X total bill and Y tip, I have to use those exact same names. Okay, so now if I rerun this cell, okay, let's see, we get here tip. Oh, just make sure you only have one quotation mark like that. Then if you still don't see the data in the graph, just make sure that you rerun the previous code cell as well, because you have to make sure that this data frame has been initialized. So that's why often putting all the code into just one code cell is easier, because you won't have to remember, did I run the previous code recently or not? So just make sure to rerun the previous code cell and then run the current code cell, because that is going to reinstantiate df for us. Okay, now if we scroll down, look at this. We now have data here in our app. So we have the title of our chart, Y versus X. The convention for a chart is to typically title it Y versus X. We have the Y label tip and the X label total bill. Then we have a bunch of data points, and the color scale is plasma. And here, the size is what indicates the color scale, referring to the number of instances. So for example, if there's only one instance of this total bill and tip, if there's only one instance of that coordinate, then the color is blue. But if there are 6 instances of that coordinate, then the size and the color is yellow. We can also change the color scale here with our selector, and look at that. We now have a whole different color scheme. So this allows us to set that. We could optionally just manually set that and not allow it to change. For that, all you have to do is, not allow this drop down. Just have the value preset. And just like that, we have built out our first Dash app with data being shown. Just like that, in just less than half an hour, we've been able to create this. And that is just awesome, because now you're going to be able to show your data science or your machine learning projects to any person, even if they don't have any experience with programming or data science. And it's quite valuable because with Dash, you can quickly find a way to tell stories with your projects. That's quite important for getting your projects out there. Awesome. Okay, now that we have successfully built our first project, I'm going to show you how you can build a second project in a slightly different format, but still using Dash. So join me in our next section where we are going to build another Dash app.